Welcome back, boils and ghouls. It's time for another one of the greatest stories never told. This time, we're going to be tackling a subject that I've been wanting to get to for a long time. Jacob Kurtzberg, better known by his pen name Jack Kirby, and more affectionately and probably more aptly referred to simply as the King of Comics, is such a vast and inescapable part of the industry that doing his career any sort of justice is a difficult task, and I have to admit a fairly daunting one at that. I've wanted to get into Kirby's career for a long time, but I don't want to get too mired down in the he said, she said blame campaigns that seem to make up such a large part of the so-called historical examinations of Kirby's career. That's simply not what this channel is about. It's taken me a while, but I think I've finally found the inn I was looking for, and I can't wait to share this series with you all. Kirby's work in the comics field is widely known and continues to be researched and documented as thoroughly as possible nearly 30 years after his passing in 1994. While his comics work is well documented, Kirby's later work, his work outside of the industry, remains virtually a mystery to most people. Since I specialize in little-known facts about well-known creators and characters, I thought this would be an opportunity to examine the life and work of one of comics' inexorable legends through a fairly unique angle. Please bear in mind, this series should be in no way construed as a be-all, end-all examination of Kirby's work for either Marvel or DC. That's not the purpose of this series, despite the fact that we will be exploring facets of his work for both companies. Rather than attempting some impossibly long, all-encompassing series, I've instead chosen to frame his work at these companies against a story far fewer people are aware of, and one that remains surprisingly fairly undocumented: Kirby's work for the proposed film Lord of Light. While it might not sound very interesting on the surface, slated for production in 1980 despite the fact that Lord of Light would ultimately remain unproduced, the story of why the movie, a film that would have been the most expensive science fiction film of all time when it entered pre-production in 1979, never happened, and how the CIA subsequently ended up with not only the film script but Kirby's production art, and how those illustrations played a pivotal role in the successful exfiltration and rescue of 6 real-life hostages during the 1981 Iran hostage crisis, all while the Lord of Light's production had their offices raided by a CIA-backed police force, were subsequently put on trial for embezzlement, and how the film's budget was mysteriously tied up in a legal black hole that took not one but 2 of the country's biggest law firms more than 24 months to unravel, and no one is able to really explain to this day, is so much more interesting. So join me for another one of the greatest stories never told, and a tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia, and another multi-part documentary series I like to call Jack Kirby's CIA Portfolio. In this week's episode, we'll be talking about Jack Kirby's not-so-triumphant return to Marvel Comics in 1975, which followed a series of devastating events during his time at DC, which had served to further diminish his already weakened spirit. How high hopes that Marvel would be a more creatively fostering and welcoming environment without Stan Lee maintaining a chokehold over the company's publications were proved entirely unfounded, and his aspirations during this time dashed to pieces once more, and how what would transpire during one of the darkest times in Jack Kirby's life would help to ultimately drive one of the most important, prolific, and talented creators who has ever worked in the industry out of comics almost entirely, while simultaneously opening up an entirely new avenue for his talents that would shape the rest of his professional career, and most importantly, finally earn Kirby a modicum of the respect and money he was so dearly due. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor, let this video play to the end. The more people that watch all the way through, the more YouTube will promote it. If you like what you see, don't forget to hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. You can sign up for membership right here on YouTube, and if that's not enough, you can make donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description, and you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. Patreon and other supporters do make these videos possible, but now let's get into it. While Jack Kirby prepared to make his way back to Marvel with high hopes that Stan Lee wouldn't be there to monitor and interfere with his creations anymore, there were two pivotal publications that perfectly set the stage for the tragic events to follow, in my opinion. The first, Origins of Marvel Comics, was published in January of 1974, and the second, Son of Origins, in October of 1975. Both just prior, with Son of Origins in particular being only months before Jack Kirby arrived back at Marvel in January of 1976. I believe there's little doubt about why these books were produced, what they said, how they said it, and perhaps most tellingly, why they were released when they were. From all appearances, while he had eventually relented and signed them, Kirby took more than 2 years with the paperwork concerning the Captain America lawsuit. Perfect Films had not forgotten this. If Mort Weisinger or Jack Schiff, hell, even Robert Kanigher held grudges against him, I don't even know how to begin to describe the vitriolic hatred and loathing that Perfect Films felt towards Jack Kirby. Having fought Joe Simon for nearly 3 years, Marvel was going out of their way to ensure in any way that they could that something like this never happened again. Despite the paltry amount that it had ended up boiling down to at the time, there were copious court costs that had added up quickly, and more importantly, Marvel feared, and rightfully so, especially in retrospect, that this court case would open the door for a floodgate of others. The loss of any number of these rather dubious cases could easily topple their carefully constructed house of cards concerning the creation and rights to the characters that they had so carefully manufactured along with Stan Lee over the past several years, both in print and in public, wherever and whenever possible. As more and more money was involved, and as Stan Lee prepared to leave the comics division of Marvel, he became the perfect method to ensure that the creation credits and the rights to nearly every one of Marvel's biggest characters was safely locked up, both legally and publicly accredited to Stan Lee, and as a result, secure with the company. While he never said as much, this is the reason that Stan Lee was most likely offered the six-figure income that he was when he prepared to leave Marvel Comics. There was a well-known, if unspoken, agreement between Stan Lee and Marvel that the seemingly generous income he was now receiving for his work outside of the comic division was essentially provided in an effort to pay Stan Lee to keep taking credit for the characters and promote his side of the narrative. Once this was done, in exchange for the handsome yearly salary, Lee would never legally challenge or support anyone who did challenge Marvel Comics concerning rights to their characters. If this weren't motive enough, Stan Lee also had a vested interest in vacuuming up as much creator credit as he could while he continued to peddle Marvel's IPs and stories to potential Hollywood executives, animation studios, and everyone in between in an effort to see them adapted and finally rise above his simple comic book roots. Problematically for Stan Lee, while he felt that these projects were necessary for Marvel's continued survival, there were a number of things that had potential investors and producers spooked, especially concerning the rights to comic book characters. While there were a few big stories breaking, the big one was the abhorrent and duplicitous treatment of Superman's creators, which was starting to hit headlines across the nation with the release of the first Superman film. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next episode, but what's important here is that Stan Lee hoped that his widely publicized sole creator credit and Marvel's unquestioned ownership of their characters would dissuade many of these fears. With no one to challenge ownership of the innumerable and highly lucrative characters in Marvel's stable, this solved one half of the equation, but Lee also reasoned that if he and he alone could claim credit for both the story and the character when pitching basically anything and everything that he'd ever worked on at Marvel, this would help to instill a great deal more faith in potential investors. In Lee's mind, this was akin to working with the author of a novel for an adaptation, and Marvel could become a one-stop shop, pumping out movies and television shows for the highest bidder. At a certain point, this appears to have become a big part of why he was so verbose and in people's face about the characters he created and the stories he wrote. Characters that historically I can empirically say with almost 100% certainty that Stan Lee had little or nothing to do with, and stories that were for the most part plotted and written by the artists he was collaborating with, not Stan Lee. Lee's greatest genius was getting everyone around him to do the heavy lifting while he took credit for it and spent most of his time in an attempt to publicly stoke that angle in any regard that he could. While he'd done it as a simple ego boost and likely as a way to control the public perception of Marvel in the beginning, it had become part and parcel for what he wanted to accomplish now. The numerous adaptations that he wanted to do weren't going to be possible if anyone else was horning in and worried about pesky technicalities like who actually created and wrote what. It was all just so much simpler if he took credit publicly and then begged for forgiveness later behind closed doors. Stan Lee had come to believe that this was the only way Marvel would overcome investors' potential hesitance to get involved with them, and it would seem he was right. Despite all odds and the slightly lower than average budgets that many of the Marvel adaptations that would follow would receive, for all of the things he had to overcome, and in the face of no one taking comic books seriously here, Stan Lee succeeded in selling a number of Marvel's biggest and best properties over the next 48 months or so. While few of the adaptations that Lee managed to get off of the ground around this time, aside from most notably the much beloved Lou Ferrigno, Bill Bixby, Incredible Hulk, would ultimately gain much of any long-term traction, there was a dizzying host of Marvel properties offered up on television over the next several years, as well as in some rarer cases even available for viewing by extremely limited film-going audiences. Between 1977 and 1979 alone, there was the CBS Amazing Spider-Man and wildly popular Incredible Hulk television shows. Overseas, Spider-Man, the much beloved Japanese Spider-Man adaptation, went into production, which would ultimately produce 41 episodes as well as a film, and a myriad of toys and other merchandise in its short half-life of only 2 years. There was even a Doctor Strange, and no less than two, count them, two absolutely terrible Captain America films, all three of which were actually supposed to be backdoor pilots for shows that never ended up happening. While he would complain years later about his mistreatment and how no one in the production seemed to take him seriously or listen to anything that he had to say, and I'm sure he did have very little say in what would eventually be committed to film, but there's little doubt that Stan Lee was involved with and oftentimes even on set for many of these productions as he tried to live out his dream of becoming a Hollywood bigwig on the back of the host of characters he'd created. As half successful as this entire endeavor might have been for him, this was despite the fact that Stan Lee never really liked comics, and he certainly never took them very seriously as far as writing them was concerned. Making money with them, well, that on the other hand was something Stan Lee had become very adept and invested in over the decades. For all of his shortcomings as a writer and as a friend, he was a shrewd and cunning businessman, and he seemed to almost have a second sense about certain things. He was far from the cool guy, but somehow, and this is in the face of fundamentally not understanding them, Stan Lee knew what the people reading Marvel Comics wanted, and he wasn't afraid to give it to them. He wasn't concerned with telling good stories or featuring fine art. Lee and Martin Goodman, his uncle, the man bankrolling the whole thing for that matter, were interested in the bottom line. Lee had managed to build a struggling, immature imprint, albeit one fueled by an absolutely fantastic concoction of talent, into a literal publishing juggernaut who would topple DC from their place as the newsstand kings after more than 3 decades. With sales on Marvel books not only at an alarming low, but seemingly dipping completely without reason or warning almost entirely across the board, Stan Lee began to preach about a deep-seated belief that he had. With television and film becoming bigger and more integral parts of how people saw the world, consumed their entertainment, and what they were exposed to or paid attention to in general, adapting Marvel's characters was absolutely vital to Marvel's continued existence, in his opinion. This was the only way that Lee believed that they would bring in new readers, and for all his rhetoric and hot air, I think that Stan Lee actually believed this, like wholeheartedly and to the core of his being. He was sure that if something wasn't done, comics were going the way of the dinosaur, and as things stood, he would go with them. He had nothing else to rest his hat on, and this could not stand. As erratic sales continued to plague even Marvel's biggest titles year after year, Lee would continue to insist that shows, movies, and other adaptations were an indispensable part of bringing in the new readers and reinvigorating sluggish sales with old readers. While this is still a debate that's going on today, I don't think that anyone who grew up, especially in eras like the 1990s, with shows such as X-Men, Spider-Man, or Batman the Animated Series could honestly say otherwise. The interest and awareness shows like this cause is an inarguable truth, and Lee's argument is one that continues to become more relevant and valid as print media becomes increasingly viewed as a somehow obsolete format. Lee was right, and I find that fact somewhat frustrating sometimes because I think comics should be able to stand on their own, but they can't. They need boosts and shots in the arm, and I can agree with Stan Lee on this. The key thing that Lee was missing, and I think a lot of people still are, is that it has to be quality content. There's a reason I bring up that spate of early to late 90s animation. For decades, aside from those of us that still worshipped at the altar of Fleischer's Superman, or the attention that the few standouts like Superman had brought, comic media had enjoyed a checkered past, to say the least. The 90s were a true renaissance period for an otherwise utterly disappointing niche of the media market. If what you're making is only vestigially connected to what you're publishing, there's little hope of bringing in and retaining any level of serious readership or interest. This, as well as a true attempt at honoring the designs and characters from their actual comic book origins, is what makes these series stand out. No one started reading X-Men because they saw that Pride of the X-Men pilot or Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Those series relied on suckering in people who were already interested in the properties to begin with, and then cashing in on this fact with detestably low budgets and zero respect for the source material. This is what Stan Lee was missing, and what would lead to his abject failure in his decades-long quest to adapt Marvel's biggest and best characters. While this would all change when Avi Arad came into the picture, that wouldn't be until much later, and at this point, Stan Lee was blindly charging ahead like a bull in a china shop. It feels like he thought it was more of a numbers game. If he just got enough stuff out there on television or movies or whatever, then people would take comics seriously, or more importantly, they'd at least take him seriously. Despite none of the shows that he developed at the time, aside from The Incredible Hulk, having any real lasting impact, as I mentioned, there was a genuine explosion of money and interest that was going on at Marvel. This just so happened to also be during the period that Jack Kirby returned to the company. Sadly, he wasn't in any kind of shape to really partake of much of it, and this blitzkrieg of interest and a lot of failed projects would only serve to further complicate the final years of Kirby's work for the company instead. Beyond making his final tenure at Marvel uncomfortable, this entire scene helped convince Jack Kirby that it was time to try something different. Kirby was tired. He had exhausted himself trying to make his fourth world, or anything he did there for that matter, at DC work, pouring much of what feels like was left in him both mentally and physically into the stories and characters. Following these taxing and ultimately unrewarding experiences, which had exhausted much of whatever fight and energy was left in him, Jack Kirby struggled to find his place at the new Marvel even more than at DC in many regards, and within months, Kirby dug in his heels and just waited out the time until his contract expired at the end of 1978. The alien landscape that he faced was both tumultuous and fraught with danger, as Kirby would quickly learn. While he'd only been gone 5 years, which might not seem like a long time, but a lot had changed. Without Kirby to set the tone and pace and kind of guide the company artistically any longer, Marvel had streamlined and homogenized what they believed to be the important aspects of Kirby's work to the point that any number of people could do what had made Kirby almost indispensable only a few years prior. I think it was a little bit more than a slap in the face when Marvel released How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way the year Jack left the company in 1978, as that book should have been called How Other Marvel Artists Think Jack Kirby Draws Marvel Comics. I mean, he was obviously slightly past his prime and becoming a bit of a handful to deal with, but this was not without provocation. Kirby had seen the absolute worst in the industry and for the most part been a victim of it. He had good reason for feeling the way that he did, and as he continued to feel increasingly threatened, he also felt like he was fundamentally at odds with the publishing house by this period. Marvel had gone in an entirely new direction. By 1976, they were really leaning into the darker, more real-world problems and plots that people seemed to enjoy so much. This wasn't as drastic as DC's obsession with death in Kirby's opinion, but it was prevalent enough that it certainly became problematic for Kirby when he came back to the company. Because he was allowed to tell the stories that he wanted to, for the most part this time around, it might seem strange that Kirby had any troubles with Marvel, but it's rather unsurprising when you begin to uncover the exact details of the nature of these problems. Most of them stemmed from the fact that this darker tone and more serious approach had found their way into the fundamental building blocks of most of Marvel's core books and their characters, especially ones like Captain America, for example. During Kirby's absence, the titular hero had discovered corruption at the highest levels of the US government, quit being Captain America as a result, started calling himself Nomad, and changed his costume because he refused to wear the American flag out of disgust for what it represented to him. There were concepts and stories dealing with Vietnam, political corruption, existential pontification of what it meant to be Captain America, this huge mythical thing that had taken on a life outside of Steve Rogers. And I'm not saying that's bad or anything, but as we've talked about, these concepts and themes were something Kirby had absolutely no interest in. Jack Kirby, even more than when he was at DC, just wanted to make people smile and maybe, if he was lucky, even have a little bit of fun. God forbid making a comic book again. I will say this though, while he might have wanted to have fun working on a book, and I genuinely think that was a lot of what was going on here, but for as much as he wanted that, Jack Kirby was not fun to deal with. When he came back to Marvel, Kirby had little desire to hop back on to basically any of the books he'd helped to not only popularize, but in a lot of cases, create. In some cases, he felt like he stood at odds with what the characters represented, and others I found absolutely no rhyme or reason to. Kirby was becoming more and more prone to making large and sweeping demands with seemingly little forethought, but not for no reason. He was struggling, and I don't think he wanted to admit it. Kirby was constantly worried about losing his job, and even though he wanted out of comics by this time, he had nowhere else to go. He could not afford to get fired from Marvel, or worse yet, breach his contract. Because of this, and regardless of what Kirby wanted or hoped for, it was many of these same flagship books that Kirby had no desire to work on, like Captain America, which Kirby had created and been so synonymous with that Stan Lee wanted him working on almost immediately. Despite putting his foot down about a few things, Kirby wasn't really in a position to put up an extreme amount of fuss when it came to Stan Lee's demands, especially at this point. To this end, these titles are where Stan Lee wanted him. So in the face of what Kirby desired and expressed repeatedly and vehemently, that's where Stan Lee stuck him. Now, while he might not have come back to Marvel as the reigning champion he'd been heralded as in the past, after what he'd gone down at DC, just like when he left for that company actually, Kirby had demands that had to be met before he would agree to sign anything. Despite his weakened bargaining position, I think Stan Lee in particular still felt like there was a lot of fertile ground as far as Jack Kirby was concerned, if they could just manage to get everyone on the same page. His page, that is, of course, with the potential for what could come of getting Jack Kirby back to Marvel. And in the interest of flagging sales, Stan Lee agreed to some radical stuff when hiring Jack Kirby back, seemingly to quash Lee's hopes of getting Kirby back to being the reliable workhorse that he had been in the past, most likely wearing down his resolve and eventually getting him to relent on most, if not all, of his initial demands, and I suspect somewhat in a retort also to Stan Lee's earliest suggestions as to where he could begin work once back at Marvel. From the onset, Jack flat out told Stan Lee and Marvel Comics that he would not be working on the Hulk, Fantastic Four, or Thor. There would be no questions, no exceptions, and no negotiations. If they wanted him back, this was part of the deal. Interestingly, all of these titles were not only universally identified with Kirby, but ones which he'd created, and with the exception of the Hulk, expressed a great deal of love for in the past. Thor, in particular, had long been a labor of love for Kirby. It had been born of his own particular interest in exploring a pantheon of gods in a way he had never been allowed to in the past, and which would continue to fascinate him until his death in 1994. As far as I'm aware, Kirby never expressly addressed his reasoning here. I don't know if he was simply uninterested in working on stuff that was near and dear to his heart, out of a fear or deep-seated belief that it was only a matter of time before someone ruined what he was doing or altered his work without his permission. One factor, in my opinion, was that both the Fantastic Four and Thor were pretty cast-heavy books, and they had pretty intricate and ornate settings in the forms of the Baxter Building and Asgard. As a result, both titles would have required a lot of drawing on Kirby's part, and working on this series, I've become increasingly convinced Kirby simply was not up to that. He was getting older, and while he never skimped on his art, I'm not sure Kirby was necessarily very interested in taking on something as heavy as Thor at this point. While I totally get both Thor and the Fantastic Four on this basis alone, and I do know he was never necessarily super pleased with where the book went after his departure following the initial series cancellation after only 5 issues, but I do wonder about the Hulk. It wasn't a super cast heavy book, and Hulk hung out in the desert like a lot. Especially in this period, the book would not have been inordinately hard to do, and Kirby did help create him. So I've always wondered why Jack Kirby was so seemingly dead set against working on the Hulk. Regardless of his reasons, this wasn't the end of Kirby's requirements for coming back to Marvel. It wasn't just books or even entire characters that Jack Kirby refused to work on. While a lot of people scoffed when Kirby outright wouldn't work on certain titles, it was what he did next that seriously ruffled feathers with other Marvel employees. Kirby absolutely, under any circumstance, refused to work with any other writer in any capacity. And this wasn't like when he'd been at DC and he made a few exceptions. As far as I know, Jack Kirby worked with one other writer during his 3 years at Marvel during this second stay. He'd been promised the moon before, and having faced nearly every worst case scenario he'd ever envisioned in one way, shape, or form, by 1976, Jack Kirby was becoming what I think you could safely call paranoid in regards to other people altering or worse yet, stealing credit for his work, a fear which was more than likely being highly amplified now once he was back at Marvel, where so many of the incidents which had birthed this paranoia had occurred. And to be fair to Kirby, I do suppose it's not really paranoia if they are in fact after you. And rest assured, they were after Jack Kirby. Kirby's refusal to allow anyone else to put their name anywhere on his books infuriated Marvel editorial and a host of people who had hoped to work with him as well. In short, due to his demands and circumstances, Kirby had a massive kick me sign on his back. While he would do his best to stay ahead of the curve and off his politics after his disastrous stint at DC, this time at Marvel was nothing short of interminable for everyone involved. Kirby was miserable, everyone knew it, and so was everyone who tried to work with him, and that, I think, was what led to the biggest problems he faced at this point. While virtually nothing went right during this second stint at Marvel for Jack Kirby, probably the biggest reason for this was that there were a lot of people at Marvel who thought the key to success, the way to being the next Stan Lee, was by writing dialogue for him. They were convinced that if they could just get their name on one of his books, weasel their way into his world for a single moment, they would be golden. They could forever pad out their resume as having worked with the king of comics. And if the series really kicked off, they might even end up making a pretty penny off of it. These aspirations stood in direct opposition to Kirby's refusal to work with anyone. It was a problem from the start, but also one which would continue to balloon up on Kirby as he staunchly refused basically any outside input or interference when it came to his books. This was not something that came out of left field or anything, and as I've mentioned, was expressly agreed upon when he returned. Almost unbelievably, especially considering how he'd been treated in the past. This also meant that not only would there be zero alterations to his work once it was completed, but Jack Kirby would write, draw, and edit his own books as a further safeguard against outside interference. No editors would change his dialogue. No one would mess with his art or his stories. Not this time. Jack Kirby knew every trick in the book, or at least he thought he did, and Jack Kirby did manage to lock outsiders away from his series extremely successfully. Outside of basically physically hijacking the pages once they were done and turned in, but before they went to press, there was almost no way to mess with Jack Kirby's work. Too successful for his own good, as was often the case, the fact he did manage to lock everyone else out would come back to bite Kirby in a big way before long. As it stood though, as far as everyone else at Marvel was concerned, Jack Kirby was working in a bubble. He was entirely cut off from the rest of Marvel and their books in nearly every conceivable fashion. While done in order to protect his work, this was a problem and it got bigger as time went on for a few reasons, as I've said. The first thing he faced, and one that has plagued his legacy as a creator historically unfortunately, was that Jack Kirby earned a reputation for being a curmudgeonly old miser who was notoriously difficult to work with during this period. People began to increasingly look down their nose at him for a host of reasons, but his refusal to work with others in any capacity, as well as his ignoring continuity and being allowed to do what most people thought was anything he wanted, would be tantamount among them. Just like Kirby's move to California and the resentment that caused, rather than being seen as Kirby standing up for himself and trying to take control of his career for the first time, it was instead perceived simply as special treatment once more. As many employees began to harbor more than a little distaste for Jack Kirby, this wouldn't be the biggest problem that Kirby faced. It was the root, but not the problem itself. Kirby refused to work with anyone else. He wrote, drew, and edited all of his own books. While this allowed for a great deal more control, there were a lot of editors at Marvel who were fighting about who would get to work on what with Kirby before he ever even got back to the company. A lot of people had plans, but as it became clear that working with him was not going to happen, certain unnamed individuals inside of Marvel began to conflate against Kirby in a concerted effort to force him into a corner that would once again allow for editorial interference and weaken his position at the company to the extent that he would have to acquiesce to any and all outside requests like he had in the past. These machinations working against him are best personified by the trials and tribulations that Jack Kirby faced at the hands of a particular assistant editor. Kirby's harassment at this individual's hands began from nearly the moment he walked in the door and would continue until he exited the company entirely fed up with the industry at the end of 1978. While he's never been named as far as I'm aware, Mark Evanier has shared details concerning a really messed up story, one which sums up the second stint of Kirby's stay at Marvel rather well actually, and lasts for its almost entire duration. As I said, problems started almost immediately for Jack Kirby, and this was in large part due to editors who wanted to write dialogue for him, but whom Kirby refused to work with in any capacity. This raised the ire of many, but one person in particular became so enraged by this that he systematically set about destroying Jack Kirby in every conceivable fashion that he could. Professionally, personally, it didn't matter. He was out to obliterate Kirby. This is unless he relented and let him work on a series, of course. This unnamed individual, who was evidently an assistant editor, had vied to be Kirby's dialogue writer, a credit which Kirby refused to extend to anyone, and had become unmovable on following the institution of the Stan Lee Presents credits. After Kirby's continued refusal to work with him, this individual eventually apparently not only started to take it super personally, but they got upset enough about it that they set about trying to sabotage Kirby's reputation and career. At first, I do think this was done in an effort to ensure that Jack Kirby would be forced to relent and work with him. At a certain point, as time went on, though, it does feel like it became more of just a really mean-spirited vendetta against someone this individual felt he had unjustly wronged him. It should be noted here, again for the record, there had been an agreement, one that not only Stan Lee and Marvel, but senior editor and higher up at Marvel, Archie Goodwin, personally agreed to. And for the record as well, Goodwin seemingly did his best to keep up. Jack Kirby's books would not get messed with. No one else was involved. Once he was finished with them and turned them in, that's the way they would see publication. After Coletta's stunt of taking his penciled pages to editors prior to publication without his knowledge at DC, Kirby was beyond adamant on this point as well. Likewise, and again in yet another redundancy to protect his work, under this new mandate and working as his own editor, if there were any problems, Kirby insisted he would be the one to fix them. No one else. No one was to touch his pages for any reason without his knowledge or express permission. There would be no one tampering or messing with his books this go around with Marvel, and Kirby admittedly took a pretty adversarial and staunch approach to ensuring, and one might even say enforcing, this fact. Again, though, I think it's extremely important to remember everything he'd been through up to this point. He'd seen every dirty trick in the book, and so help him, he felt like he'd finally figured out a way to bypass the system and make things work with Marvel this go-around. As his own editor, answering supposedly only to Goodwin and Lee directly, operating entirely outside the scope of Marvel proper, Kirby remained steadfast on doing every aspect of the books he was producing at this point that he possibly could. They might not have been his best work, but they were sure as heck going to be his work and no one else's, and therein lies the problem. Seeing Kirby as an essential stepping stone to advancing his career and not understanding Kirby's continued refusal to work with him, the unnamed editor at Marvel, who was unsuccessfully trying to insert himself into Kirby's work up to this point, took things to a whole new level. In large part because Jack Kirby was so successful in locking others out of his work and learning to play the game. This assistant editor, I think, figured out that he wasn't just going to waltz in and work on a Kirby project. Hell, by the time he started really playing dirty pool, it was probably evident nothing short of stealing Kirby's original art was going to get him access to it. Rather than just take the hint and move on, though, he doubled down, and this is where it feels like things started to get personal. Previously, this editor had begun to badmouth Jack Kirby, especially raking his writing and dialogue over the coals. He complained to other editors, he complained to fans, and he even complained to Archie Goodwin himself about the lackluster quality of the material that Jack Kirby was producing. This editor was also, however, adamant about the fact that if they were allowed to write the dialogue and given input over the stories and other aspects of the book, that they could easily make it work and turn the lackluster sales on Kirby's books around. Although this individual criticized Kirby's writing in general, the majority of his ire was aimed at Kirby's dialogue, and I think there's little argument to be made here. Kirby's dialogue was heavy-handed. It was at times uneven, and it had become increasingly ham-fisted as he got older. This was a totally valid criticism of Kirby's work, but here's the thing. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have been an issue or even a conversation, actually. Jack Kirby had negotiated that he would write the dialogue, no one else. This was part of the contractual agreement that he had made when he started working for Marvel Comics again, and Marvel had agreed. End of sentence. While this was the case for a time, as this assistant editor grew increasingly vocal, he began to turn the bullpen and many of Marvel's employees against Kirby in an effort to weaken Kirby's safeguards over his work, which only worked with the support of the editorial staff to oversee that they were enforced. Eventually, he successfully turned enough people against Jack Kirby that it finally allowed him to get his hands on Kirby's not yet printed pages. He quickly seized the opportunity to tamper with and entirely rewrite portions of Kirby's dialogue after it had been completed, both without Kirby's knowledge or consent and in direct violation of the agreement, the contractual agreement that Kirby had made when he returned to Marvel in 1976. Archie Goodwin was pretty intent on honoring the agreement, as I mentioned, however, and it did not take long before the revisions were discovered. When he and Jack Kirby learned of the changes, Goodwin tried his best to prevent anything like this from ever happening again in the future, with major parts of the editorial staff and much of the bullpen now in opposition of Kirby due to what they perceived as a superiority complex on Kirby's part, as well as resentful of the special accommodations afforded to him, accommodations Marvel would never have offered them. Goodwin's attempts to curb this behavior were to little avail. Not only were many at the company now set against Jack Kirby, but there were other problems as well, even those that didn't feel resentful of Jack Kirby's treatment, and fewer still those that understood his rigid stance on collaboration, found it difficult to argue that the quality of his dialogue hadn't begun to suffer. Even his admirers began to wonder if it wouldn't be better if there were someone there to just smooth out Kirby's rough edges and pound the story into place a little bit more. This wasn't possible with Kirby's agreement still being enforced, or at least as well as it could be by Marvel editorial. Unfortunately, not long after Kirby arrived back at Marvel, Goodwin had begun to lose much of his clout at the company. Ironically, Goodwin was also being seen as a dinosaur, and his attempts to help out Kirby only served to turn more people against him. Once again, due to editorial interference and ego, Jack Kirby would find himself the target of a calculated campaign to humiliate and discredit him. As tensions mounted between Kirby and this assistant editor, who no one will publicly name, things started to get really, really nasty. He stopped just complaining to editorial and seemed unsatisfied even when he managed to get his hands on and mess with Kirby's work. At one point, in one of the most abhorrently detestable stories I think I've ever actually heard about the industry, this individual called Jack Kirby at home to tell him that the latest issue of Captain America he'd sent him looked great, but that, quote, everyone agrees the writing is shit. This person, along with several other shunned would-be Kirby collaborators and detractors, began leaking anonymous interviews to fanzines claiming that Kirby's dialogue and stories were the reason for the poor sales on the books he was working on. While his dialogue might have been bad, this claim was total fabrication. The industry was in a well-documented state of flux that no one could wrap their heads around. According to Archie Goodwin, sales on books would, quote, fall or just bottom out for no reason. While he was a Kirby supporter, this was not a statement made in support of Captain America or Jack Kirby. It was a statement made from a man who had been working in comics nearly as long as Kirby and who could not understand what was happening with the market. No one could. Despite their validity or why people were making them, these statements about how Kirby was washed up and how he didn't care anymore stung him to the core. Above all else, Kirby had always had the respect of the other creators. They might not have liked his stuff or even understood it, but they knew it was good. There was no arguing that. This was changing though, and it hurt a lot. As the tides turned against him once again, more and more people at Marvel seemed to have it out for Jack Kirby for a host of reasons. As a result, the already tryingly hard to work with creator became increasingly defensive and difficult to work with. As more people in the Marvel offices seemed to have it out for him, this did not help his cause. When Kirby was given his first assignment back at Marvel on Captain America, he tried to immediately turn the book down. Kirby and Evanier thought on it for a while, and Evanier eventually suggested that rather than putting Kirby back on the now continuity-heavy titular ongoing monthly title, they should invent a new one instead. In the new book, they would have Kirby do stories about Captain America set back in World War II, so we didn't need to worry about what was going on with the book or had been going on with the book for the past 5 years. Just as importantly, since Marvel already had this era of Captain America starring in the Invaders at the time, as well as the fact they didn't want to squander the possible potential of tacking Jack Kirby's name on one of the biggest flagship books they had, one which had continuously floundered since Kirby's departure for DC, they summarily dismissed the idea. While Kirby and Evanier tried in vain to pitch Marvel on a few other ideas, they were having none of it. Stan Lee wanted Kirby back on at least one of the big books that he'd helped create during his original run there, and since he wouldn't work on the Fantastic Four, the Incredible Hulk, or Thor, Captain America was the only logical place that he saw for Jack Kirby. Having exhausted his leverage, and with it becoming increasingly obvious Stan Lee was not going to drop the subject until he took one of the books that he offered him, Jack Kirby finally relented and agreed to work on the book. This didn't come without caveats either, though. While he knew he had to turn in his quota of pages, from all the accounts I can find, in one last defiant act, and I believe a final effort to express to Lee just how little interest he had in the idea, Jack Kirby flat out told Stan Lee and the rest of Marvel editorial that if he took over the book, it was going to be his book. He didn't like what they'd done with the character over the past few years, and to be more exact, he didn't particularly care what anyone aside from himself had done. He didn't care about continuity. Captain America wouldn't be showing up in a million other books a month, and if he did, it wouldn't matter because Jack Kirby would entirely ignore this fact in his own monthly title. And he also insisted that there would be no needless crossovers with characters in sad attempts to boost sales and interest that meddled with the stories he was trying to tell, like there had been in the past. He was going to do whatever he wanted to, and there was nothing that anyone could say or do to either change his mind or change that work once it was done. And he told Marvel as much. He told Marvel he was going to completely ignore continuity, and that his book would basically exist outside of the confines of the regular Marvel universe. Kirby was not afraid of sharing this with other people, a fact which I think greatly contributed to the mutinous feelings that many began to harbor against him concerning what they felt was a lack of respect for their work on Jack Kirby's part. Not everyone felt this way, which I think is well illustrated by a conversation that Kirby had with Tony Isabella, who was actually writing Captain America when he took it over. Isabella, who is a massive Jack Kirby fan, called him up with a gracious offer of easily and simply explaining what had been happening with the series so that he could catch up, or even providing issues for Kirby to read if he wanted them. Kirby kindly thanked Isabella, but informed him that he didn't care what had been going on. He explained that if he was going to be writing the series, he was going to do it his way. Kirby wanted to take Captain America back to its roots, his roots. Captain America was his creation, or co-creation after all, and it didn't matter what papers he'd signed for who, he always would be. While a lot of people, especially the editors at Marvel, as well as their confused and upset readers, thought that Jack Kirby was acting like something of a prima donna, ignoring years of stories and work from other creators, Tony Isabella actually said, quote, "Quite frankly, I thought that was a good approach." Rather than simply taking the book back to its roots or anything like that, I think much of what was going on is that Jack Kirby's mind wasn't as quick as it had been in the past. He didn't have room for all of the convoluted stories and character concepts that would have muddled the vision that he had for the series. Kirby hoped to live out his glory days on the title once more, to have fun working on it and make what he could of it with this situation, but once again, it feels like Jack Kirby found himself at odds with the overall aesthetic and tone of the publisher he was working for entirely. The way Marvel now handled their characters, the way they treated their writers and artists, Kirby wasn't a fan of any of it. But he'd signed on for a 3-year tour, and he had to do something for the company. Begrudgingly, and with all of the caveats that we've talked about, he took over Captain America, but problems erupted almost immediately when Kirby's work was tampered with by this disgruntled editor whom Kirby refused to hire as his dialogue writer that we talked about. As I said, the first time that this happened, Kirby approached Archie Goodwin. Goodwin, a staunch Kirby supporter and a good friend, quickly agreed, looking at the changes that they'd been rather needless. Someone was sticking their nose where it didn't belong. Goodwin attempted to put a stop to it, and this helped for a while. When Goodwin stepped down and was replaced by a young Jim Shooter, however, things got ugly all over again. Speaking on this time, Jim Shooter said years later, quote, "I would gently edit Kirby's pages. If what he said in a word balloon made sense at all, I left it alone, except for punctuation. If I figured out what he was trying to say and he wasn't really saying that, I would suggest that maybe he change it. And he always did. He didn't have a problem with it. He was a joy." Unsurprisingly, while Jim Shooter recalls a mutually respectful and harmonious relationship, Jack Kirby could not have disagreed with him more. Kirby recalls an acrimonious relationship where Shooter abused his position as editor to mess with his work wherever and however he wanted to, despite the contractual agreement that Kirby had made with Marvel when he came back to work there. At a point, Kirby was so annoyed by Jim Shooter's changes to his work following Goodwin's departure, as Kirby felt like this was Marvel reneging on their agreements to not tamper with his work, and rightfully so in my opinion, but Jack Kirby was so pissed off that he actually went to Stan Lee. This never happened. Kirby rarely went to anyone, and Stan Lee and Kirby's relationship had been obviously strained for nearly as long as either one of them could remember. While they might not have been best friends, and Lee was increasingly less involved with the actual comics that Marvel put out, his power over them was unarguably undiminished. Stan Lee was Marvel Comics. His word was law. But even he could not save Kirby from the constant harassment he was now faced with. When Jack Kirby sent Stan Lee photocopies of before and after examples of what had been done to his work, Lee, in a rather rare move, not only agreed that the challenges violated their agreement, but successfully intervened on Kirby's behalf, personally, at least in this particular case. Unfortunately, this behavior was again becoming endemic. There seemed little anyone could do to stop it. Every time they tried to put an end to it, this assistant editor or Jim Shooter or whoever would find the one chink in the armor. Despite innumerable attempts at doing so, while they would curb this behavior by fixing one problem for a while, it was only a matter of time before their enemies discovered a new weakness and exploited that in order to do the exact same thing all over again. While the editorial tampering and the bad-mouthing of his writing and dialogue never stopped, Jack Kirby didn't really have any choice but to grit and bear it. He needed the money like he always did, and he was under contract for several more years. Jack Kirby had to do the work just like everyone else, whether he liked it or not, and whether anyone else at the company thought so or not. While the heart was increasingly ebbing from his work, especially on Captain America at the time, Kirby was soon forced to take on another assignment in mid-1976. It was a rather strange book, but one that would actually go on to become regarded as perhaps Kirby's best work during this period at Marvel, and unusually was generally well received and earned a fair amount of interest and support at the time of its actual publication. 2001: A Space Odyssey. Whereas when DC approached Kirby about appropriating elements of Planet of the Apes and turning that into a series because they'd lost out on the license and he hadn't even seen the film and was only peripherally aware of the plot, this was not the case for 2001. While the assignment was not a pleasant experience for him, Jack Kirby did an almost inconceivably good job of what many felt the impossible task of successfully adapting not only the Kubrick film without losing any of the grandeur or intelligence of the source material, but the novel as well. While much of Kirby's work at Marvel between 1976 and 1978 was met with a pretty fair level of ambivalence, 2001 did well enough that after it was printed in the original Treasury oversized volume, it was printed at a regular size, and then because Marvel still had the rights for a certain amount of time, and that did well enough, it actually turned into an ongoing series as well. If people had scoffed when Kirby tried to adapt the movie, they balked when he was tasked with telling original stories inside of the 2001 universe. And yet Kirby, again, achieved what most people saw as an impossibility, continuing tales inside of the 2001 universe that actually built on and added to the source material, not diluted it. This was achieved mostly by trying to replicate the cycle and story elements from the film and the novel with small twists, and while he did an admirable job, the series overall does read fairly unevenly. This, however, isn't actually Kirby's fault and is mostly due to his being pulled in every direction imaginable while working on this series. Licensed properties are always a creative quagmire and minefield, but with something as prestigious as 2001, there's going to be an added level of interference from both the licensor and the licensee. In this case, MGM insisted that there be no recurring or centralized character and that the book should be an anthology of seemingly unconnected tales. Marvel thought that the key to engendering more interest and support for the book was by introducing a centralized character and intelligently building on the world elements that Kubrick and Clark had introduced in the film and the novel. Kirby actually hit on this idea when he was working on the adaptation of the film in the first place for the Treasury edition. Rather than laboriously or slavishly tie himself to the film that audiences had already seen, he incorporated elements from an earlier version of the script before Hal had been rewritten, as well as elements from the original novel by Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick that never found their way into the film. This helped to not only give the story its own voice, but made the comic work stand apart, but completely within the tone and aesthetic of the world that readers expected going in. Kirby had hit on this almost right away, but there was endless squabbling between Marvel and MGM, neither of which could agree on how the book should be handled. Kirby hung in limbo for the first 8 issues or so, before eventually, somehow, the two companies came together and Jack Kirby was finally told to come up with a central protagonist for the book. For the next issue, you might imagine Jack Kirby was a tad bit upset about this request, as it came so late and once again required him to come up with another original character he was simply supposed to pull out of thin air. At this point, he was neither surprised, upset, or cared, however. Nonplussed, Kirby happened to be working on a story about a robot and decided that would be his recurring character. He called up Marvel and he gave them the names X-51, the robot's actual serial number designation, and Mr. Machine. Marvel, however, soon discovered that the utterly original name Mr. Machine was shockingly already in use by Ideal Toys and quickly asked Kirby to change it. Kirby came back with Machine Man, and X-51, aka Machine Man, aka Aaron Stack, became the main character of the book starting the next issue. The series was one of the few real successes that Kirby had during this period, both critically and sales-wise, and as such, he tried his best to feign enthusiasm over the series. He would write some of the weirdest essays and editorials for the series of his entire career. And the art is nothing short of awesome for 2001, but it wasn't what he wanted to be doing. He might have been good at it, but he did not enjoy it. He missed the thrill of working on books that he had at least some sort of stake in. Around this time, at some point in early 1977, Marvel acquired another license that Gil Kane and Steve Englehart were originally attached to, but which Stan Lee personally handed over to Jack Kirby instead following the success of 2001, The Prisoner. While it was never released by Marvel, and at only 17 pages was never completed either, there was an astounding artist edition of the series released a few years ago, which I have dreamed of owning a copy of for almost as long. While out of print today, unfortunately, the release offered a glimpse at some of the most uncompromised and inspired Kirby pencils and inks to have ever seen the light of day. The Prisoner, while radically different from much of his comic book work, ironically reads as much more of an autobiographical parable. The tortured looks and hauntingly gaunt faces of his characters were taking on the look of Kirby, who was increasingly tired and unfocused. Uninspired and with the vision in his eye becoming a serious problem his anchors just couldn't cover up all the time anymore, Kirby found himself at a crossroads. He was 60 years old. He'd spent his entire life in comics, and as he himself would say later, they'd done nothing but break his heart. Jack Kirby had created Captain America with Joe Simon in 1941, and despite at one point being perhaps the most highly lauded and in-demand artist in the field, he found himself more than 3 decades later working for the same people, drawing the same character for nearly the same pay. desperate for some sort of out, any option that would let him leave Marvel when his contract expired in 1978. Kirby waited out the rest of his time, impatiently pumping out whatever Marvel required of him without batting an eye or much of any interest in the material either. He'd never been a big fan of the series himself, and Marvel decided that 2001 wasn't selling well enough to warrant relicensing the property when the original licensing agreement was up, but it also wasn't doing poorly enough to justify completely canning the title and getting rid of Kirby's new creation either. Marvel decided on keeping 2001 going, but renaming it Machine Man and kind of ignoring any aspects of the story that might stray into problems when it came to rights with the novel or the movie. Jack rather ambivalently just kept his head down and did what he was told. The love was gone, and honest to God, I don't know if Jack Kirby knew what he wanted out of comics at this point. Aside from decent pay, credit for what he'd done, and health care. But he sure as hell wasn't getting any of that out of Marvel. As time pressed on, Kirby managed to upset more than a few people in both Marvel management and editorial, as well as fans, with his continued insistence on completely removing his work, especially from Captain America, from the rest of Marvel's other titles, their characters, their continuity, and in fact, basically all of Captain America's continuity leading up to Kirby's latest run on the series. Kirby was getting older. He wasn't as quick on his feet as he once had been, and truth be told, this is the reason that his series took place out of continuity. Even Mark Evanier said that it had nothing to do with not respecting other people or their work, or even that he didn't like the stories. He simply couldn't work that way anymore. Kirby, being his own editor and given almost complete creative control, eventually led to some rather interesting situations, such as when Captain America ended up fighting a South American dictator called the Swine, who heavily resembled Lenin. John Lennon, that is. No one was happy about that one, and Jack Kirby took a lot of flack over it, both publicly as well as behind closed doors. Kirby had been promised autonomy when he came back to the company, but many were beginning to see him as more of a problem than anything else. He was becoming a loose cannon in many editors' eyes at Marvel, and while I'll agree he was getting more difficult to work with, I think much of what was held against him was totally unfair, and Jack Kirby was entirely acting out of simple self-preservation. Justified or not, I also don't think this was so much Jack trying to be difficult as it was his simply being finally unable to keep up with the inhuman work schedule that he had fastidiously maintained for the better part of 35 years. Unlike in the past, when he was simply able to push through it and force his body to work, by 1977 he physically couldn't do it. And as his time at Marvel progressed, there are pretty evident signs he couldn't mentally handle it either. I do not mean to imply that Jack Kirby had a mental breakdown or he was on the verge of going crazy or anything. What I mean is that there were pretty clear signs, and if you listen to his later interviews, you can clearly pick them out, that Jack Kirby was beginning to suffer from problems with his memory. It wasn't super problematic or even extremely noticeable at first, but eventually there came a point where it was evident, even to those that were still defending him and the complete creative and editorial autonomy that he was being afforded, that Kirby might not be up to the task of doing everything like he had been in the past. It might be in his best interest to have someone look over his completed work and final pages before they saw print. Among his final and most staunch supporters who defended Kirby's right to work freely as he had been told that he would be allowed to was actually Stan Lee. After Kirby had been forced to go up the ladder concerning editorial tampering, and by this point acutely aware that he was not Kirby's favorite person in the world, Stan Lee knew there was a problem. Lee does sincerely seem to have done his best, at least in his mind, to have made Jack's time at Marvel as easy as he could, and he was one of the last people in Kirby's corner when it came to letting him publish what he wanted to for a change. He didn't always go about it properly, and he certainly wasn't going out of his way to get Jack better pay or anything, but he did at least try to ensure that Jack received the treatment he was promised when he came back to Marvel in 1976, as far as I can tell. This was for two reasons, though. Stan Lee, I think, honestly began to feel increasingly resentful of a lot of people who were taking Kirby for granted at this point. People seemed to be oblivious that Jack Kirby had built Marvel only a decade and a half prior, that his artistic genius had seemed unrivaled, how no one had ever seen anything like him before, how his work bristled with energy and the man himself was exploding with ideas rather than respect or even understanding. As Kirby was getting older, there were staff leveling anonymous allegations about Kirby's poor dialogue writing being the reason for Marvel's sale troubles, and at some point they even started pinning up Jack Kirby's pages on the walls of the Marvel office and covered them with snide and vitriolic slander. I think that's what really got to both Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. People making fun of him behind his back. As unimaginable as it seems, there were comments almost wherever he went. I mean, his pages were pinned up on the walls of the Marvel office like some high school bathroom with all the younger cool kids making fun of him in front of everyone. The Jack the Hack moniker began to get tossed around more and more. No one liked Jack Kirby anymore outside of his small circle of supporters. Then there was an incident which called into question Kirby's capabilities and threatened his autonomy at Marvel in a very real way. During the height of Kirby's clashes with Marvel's ambitious young assistant editors, who were doing everything in their power to sink him, which included trash-talking his dialogue and saying that he didn't mentally have it in him to operate as his own editor anymore, Jack Kirby sent in a story and entirely left out a page. This was not like Kirby, and there's some serious debate as to whether he simply forgot to send in the page or he forgot to do it entirely. When Archie Goodwin, one of his oldest friends and biggest supporters, got the pages, like it or not, he knew there was a problem. It's Goodwin's belief that there was a good likelihood that Jack Kirby hadn't forgotten to send in the page, but forgotten to draw it to begin with. A friend until the end, and a good man in general, rather than reveal this fact to any of the bullpen or try to get an artist to just do the missing page, Archie Goodwin went straight to Stan Lee, and not to narc Kirby out. I think they both agreed something was amiss, but rather than address the situation in the way that I was expecting by this point, Goodwin gently called Kirby from his personal phone at home that night to address the situation. Kirby explained that he'd just forgotten to send in the page, and he did supply the missing page, but for many employees at Marvel who found out about it, despite Goodwin and Lee's best efforts, this was the last straw. They didn't just think Kirby was losing it anymore, they knew it. There was a growing divide between Jack Kirby and the rest of Marvel that was hard to ignore. Kirby was becoming generally less associated and interested in Marvel books, and in many ways, the feeling was mutual. Despite this, Marvel would continue to pick and choose from Kirby's creations and stories and end up appropriating some major elements from his work, even during this period where people were literally pinning his work to the walls of the office and making fun of him behind his back. I think the best example of this problematic dichotomy that was going on was evidenced in The Celestials. Based loosely on the wildly popular bestseller Chariots of the Gods from 1968, Marvel saw an opportunity with the new Kirby book and its connection to Chariots of the Gods, which in turn shared a passing resemblance to Kirby's Fourth World creation, New Gods. At this point, someone changed the name of the proposed series from The Celestials to Return of the Gods, I believe. Unfortunately, as with many things that occurred with Jack Kirby during this period, the water is a little murky as to the chain of events that took place concerning the name changes, and I do emphasize changes multiple here for a reason. I think the Return of the Gods name came about because of a proposed series that DC was working on for their Showcase series, wherein they were reviving Kirby's failed Fourth World creations. This series was being touted as Return of the New Gods, and it's not hard to connect the dots there. While Marvel partially cribbed DC's proposed series in some regards, they apparently leaned really hard into the whole Chariot of the Gods thing in an attempt to cash in on the non-fiction books' popularity at the time as well. Marvel went so far as to produce a cover for the first issue of the series, still under the banner of Return of the Gods, in the exact same font from the first printing of Chariot of the Gods, the novel. At some point, someone at Marvel caught on to what was going on, and legal demanded that it be changed before they got the crap sued out of them. While I believe that Jack Kirby had initially pitched the series under the name The Celestials, as I mentioned, before being forced to change the name for the reasons we've discussed, when Marvel decided that along with the font, the name of the series needed changing again too, believing that DC might get more than a little upset by the stunt, they still didn't go with Kirby's proposed title either. Instead, this was when they changed the name of the book to The Eternals, the name which would stick with the book for the rest of its rather short existence. While Eternals wouldn't actually get canceled at the time, like so many of his other books during this period that never managed to survive his departure from the company in 1978, it would get canceled in the beginning of 1979. There was no arguing that The Eternals was a strange book, too. And I'm not just talking about the concept of it either. In a lot of ways, The Eternals well encapsulates the struggles that Kirby dealt with at Marvel during the entirety of his career, creative freedom aside, all in one place. Marvel had no clue what to do with the book, but they would again and again try to shoehorn it into continuity and force it into working with the rest of the Marvel Universe at large somehow once Kirby left the series and they were allowed to do with it what they wanted. While Marvel might have appropriated elements of the story later, when he wrote it, Kirby created and wrote the entirety of the Eternals outside of the Marvel Universe. And not like Captain America. I mean entirely outside of it. Even the cosmic one that he had created there in years past, the Eternals had zero connections to anything else that Marvel was doing. It didn't read like their other stuff. And just like with his Captain America work, Kirby refused to incorporate any pre-existing Marvel characters into his work. This strange place outside the Marvel Universe proper was the complete antithesis of what Marvel readers had come to expect and a large part of what Marvel editorial believed they enjoyed. And all things aside, and much love to the king, but by 1977, Kirby was entirely incapable of even concerning himself with the rest of the Marvel Universe. He didn't like the stories, he didn't enjoy the characters, he did not care about what the rest of the company was doing. While this was for more complex reasons than anyone suspected, which were largely misinterpreted at the time, as I've repeatedly mentioned, this did not go over well with fans, or editorial, or Marvel in general. Eternals never really managed to get any traction or footing, and much like his creations, The Inhumans, Marvel has continuously struggled to successfully integrate the Eternals into the Marvel Universe proper. However, this is fairly interesting in both cases. While Marvel has never gotten an Eternals or Inhumans series to work post-Kirby, at this point, they've become integral parts of the origins and birth of the Marvel Universe. They're strange and complex origins, exploring pantheons of godlike beings. Aliens, as confusing as they might have been, are in large part now used to explain much of how and why the Marvel Universe came to exist. The Celestials introduced here are literally responsible for seeding the birth of the Marvel multiverse today, despite having been created entirely outside of the scope of continuity of the regular Marvel Universe at the time. I don't think the failure of Eternals to capture audiences was on Marvel. It wasn't that they didn't try to make it work, or even that they didn't like or support the series like I had imagined. There was something off about Kirby's work. It doesn't feel like much of anything else that he ever worked on, despite sharing a great deal in common with much of it. There were points in the Eternals where it simply did not make sense. The series was uneven and disjointed, and despite exploring concepts that Jack Kirby was genuinely interested in for a change, Ideas concerning godlike pantheons of alien beings, which had continuously popped up in his work in the past and would continue to do so until his death at 78, it never came together in any real kind of way. It lacked the punch, it lacked the energy, and it lacked the imagination of his work only a few short years before during his time at DC, despite sharing much in common with the subject matter. And Kirby now being afforded the creative and editorial control that he had been dreaming of his entire career, it felt like a wasted opportunity in a lot of regards. It's not that the art or even the story is bad. I just get caught up in imagining what it would have been like had Kirby ever been given this level of authority and autonomy and freedom during the heyday of his career. The magnificent things he could have conceived of, the fantastic stories we would have read. Instead of reading like a love letter to his freedom like it should have, the time for this had come and gone, and in many ways, the Eternals feels like Jack Kirby was just winding down. He produced an extremely impressive amount of work in the 3 years that he stuck around Marvel during this second stint. He was finally free to explore the stories and concepts that he wanted to away from editorial and artistic restrictions for the most part. Marvel had missed the boat, and what followed was a volley of needless embarrassments at the hands of people who saw Kirby as being entirely outmoded and outdated, while continuously failing to see Kirby was still working just a few years too far ahead of the curve. While Kirby had immediately been assigned to Captain America upon his return and had then been saddled with 2001 as well as a proposed Prisoner adaptation in 1976, it wasn't until 1977, after the launch of Kirby's Eternals, when Stan Lee would call upon him, as he had so many times in the past, to revive a then-dying title. Kirby was reunited with one of his old creations, the Black Panther, whose book Jungle Adventures had recently been cancelled. Or Marvel was planning on canceling it. It depends on who you ask. Some people claim that the Black Panther was a dead series, not a dying one. There was no hope of Kirby reviving a series that they had literally already canceled when Lee assigned it to him, though. Others claim that Kirby's new direction for the title was so dramatic that Jungle Adventures, which hung on the precipice of cancellation, was canceled simply in an effort to clear the board and make it abundantly clear to readers that this was a new series with a dramatically new direction. While I personally think the art is actually really interesting on Kirby's work for this volume of Black Panther, it was weird. Not bad, but very, very weird. The Black Panther spent the entirety of the series running around with a sidekick, rescuing priceless artifacts and returning them to their rightful owners. If this concept sounds slightly familiar, you're definitely not wrong. I think there's little doubt that this run had a direct impact on Indiana Jones. As always, though, Raiders of the Lost Ark wouldn't be released until 2 years after this volume of the Black Panther was summarily cancelled. At the time, everyone at Marvel was making fun of Kirby's quirky plot for the series, and it failed to garner fans' attention as well. Before Kirby took over the series, Lee had actually suggested that, quote, if Kirby couldn't make the title sell, they should just cancel it. So they did. As with nearly every book that Jack Kirby worked on, aside from Captain America, the Black Panther was canceled almost immediately once Kirby left Marvel at the end of 1978. It was during this period around 1977 that I think Kirby finally had his spirit broken. His body had long since failed him, and he had a few serious medical scares by this point, but as Stan Lee continued to make headway with getting Marvel's highly lucrative creations adapted, the company and Lee himself once again set about to show that Lee, and Lee alone, was Marvel Comics and the undisputed creator of Marvel's characters, publicly painting him as the literal face of the company. While Stan Lee continued to gain accolades, as well as secure a number of lucrative personal endorsement deals as a result of the company's constant insistence that he was the real genius behind the company to anyone that would listen, and was being paid a six-figure income for being a comics ambassador, Jack Kirby in juxtaposition was starting to lose his vision. He was laboring for an insultingly low wage, and people were actually making fun of him at the very same company he had literally helped build from the ground up less than 20 years to his face. To say that his work's constant failure to garner attention, as well as Lee's constant claims that he was the creator of nearly every one of Marvel's characters, were difficult for him to stomach would be a huge understatement. Kirby was absolutely sick of it, but he was also still under contract. Once again, Jack Kirby was forced to basically swallow his anger and try to make the best of the situation. In the past, Jack Kirby might have stumbled. He might have even failed at getting the sales people thought that he should, but he always came out swinging with some of the best, most inventive, and bitingly original works ever created for the medium. This time, Jack Kirby never bounced back, though. Marvel had finally managed to break unarguably one of the most talented men to have ever worked in the industry, and they didn't even seem to care. Hell, they didn't even seem to notice. Jack Kirby was an afterthought, a relic from a forgotten time. No one cared what he was doing. They wouldn't even come into his little office except to poke fun and ridicule him. Even Stan Lee and Archie Goodwin, who were as close to allies in his fight that Jack Kirby had as things got more and more difficult to handle for him in every sense that you can imagine, I don't think ever made any real concerted efforts to help Jack Kirby out. They especially didn't make any pushes to get Jack Kirby the one thing that he needed most. More than better page rates, more than a better contract, creative freedom, or being his own editor. At 60 years of age and no retirement, Jack Kirby desperately needed health care. His mind was beginning to revolt against him, making his complex daily operations, duties, and ever-looming deadlines more difficult. Jack Kirby's innermost fears of becoming a burden to his family seemed to be manifesting themselves. If things continued on, if he kept pushing himself to the limits of mental and physical exhaustion like he had been for decades, there was a very real chance he was going to end up just like he'd always worried he would, unemployable and a financial millstone around his family's neck. In the past, he'd harbored hopes that perhaps the younger generation of artists at Marvel, those who had quite literally grown up on his work, might come to his aid. Now, as things actually came to pass, it was the exact opposite. Everyone at Marvel had this stilted and tainted view of Kirby as being difficult to work with and entitled absolutely for no reason by 1977. Marvel began to turn increasingly against Kirby, and I think the final straw for a lot of people came in the form of yet another stand that Jack Kirby was making, refusing time and time again to include any other Marvel characters in his Captain America work. Kirby felt like this would not only interfere with the flow of the stories he was trying to tell, but that it was editorial interference, which he had been expressly promised wouldn't be an issue. Editors and even Archie Goodwin and Stan Lee tried talking to Kirby, and when there was a suggestion made that they compromise on Captain America taking place out of continuity and the rest of the Marvel Universe, but at least including villains from other titles, Kirby was beyond resistant to the idea, to say the least. In the few cases where he was seemingly strong-armed into finally including characters, he would constantly make these bizarre notes in the stories that while these characters appeared to be some of Marvel's most famous creations, they were in fact robots or alien beings that simply resembled those characters. Jack Kirby had told Stan Lee that he didn't want to take over Captain America when he started on the book, and he had meant it. Lee hadn't listened, but by this point it was clear that there was going to be no middle ground between the two, and Kirby was eventually taken off of the title. This is when Roy Thomas had then handed him Black Panther, but in many regards I don't think it mattered what Kirby did after his problems on Captain America and his refusal to work with Marvel on nearly anything. He was increasingly combative as his body and mind failed him, while surrounded by an increasingly hostile work environment that was actually filled with people who wanted nothing more than to see Jack Kirby not only fail, but basically be excommunicated from comics entirely. Despite their problems, when Marvel found out DC was in the process of adapting Commandy for a Saturday morning cartoon show, Stan Lee seized on an opportunity. Stan Lee told Kirby to basically come up with a pitch packet for a series, even though Kirby didn't know it at the time. A set of characters and a premise that Marvel could sell as a cartoon in order to compete with DC's proposed Commandy series. Stan Lee used Kirby's art as a major selling point on proposed animation projects, telling producers he had the artist who had actually come up with Commandy on staff, and he could get him to do whatever they needed or wanted. While he worked as a filler artist at Fleischer Studios back in the 30s, I believe, and despite his belief to the contrary, he didn't know a whole heck of a lot about animation, though. I don't think he knew at the time that Stan Lee sent him off to create a series that he was doing the work of several people, and in a fraction of the time it usually took them for a unbelievable fraction of the money. Unaware of the extra work he might have been tasked with, this feels very much like the most fun that Kirby actually probably had on a series while at Marvel. Absolutely ridiculous, and yet way more fun than it has any right to be. Jack Kirby came up with a proposal for a series he dubbed Devil Dinosaur of the Phantom Continent. Marvel immediately shortened the title to simply Devil Dinosaur, as well as promptly requested that Kirby completely overhaul the main character from an adolescent human to an alien named Moon Boy, but they didn't really mess with the premise much. It was all there. Ingeniously simple and easily accessible, Devil Dinosaur has gone on, as with many of Kirby's works, especially from this period, to become something of a cult classic, which is still represented by a newer incarnation of the character in Marvel Comics today. While entirely developed and published to compete with the proposed Commandy series, neither one would ever make it into production. The series fizzled out and was canceled with Jack's departure from the company after only 9 issues. The entire thing would have seemed senseless and futile, a complete waste of time and effort. That is, if Kirby still cared, which by this point I can honestly say I don't think he did. This is not to say that he was getting lazy with his art, and especially not to imply he wasn't trying anymore, because he most assuredly was. He was simply resigned to the fact that he was destined to work on a seemingly endless line of meaningless projects and assignments destined for failure for a million reasons which were out of his control, and he couldn't summon the will to give a crap about any of it anymore. By the end of 1977, Jack Kirby was just going through the motions and doing his best at whatever Marvel put in front of him. It was during this period that Jack Kirby would be reintroduced to the world of animation proper. While it would ultimately go on to have an untold impact on his career and much of what he would do with the latter half of his professional life, Kirby's first work in the animation field was far from pleasant. Kirby's work for Marvel in the animation field began in earnest here, aside from the extremely early and primitive animation that they had helped produce in the mid-60s, using actual Kirby artwork for the limited animation. And this was on the 1978 Fantastic Four series produced by Hanna-Barbera. After the failure of both Commandy and Devil Dinosaur to reach television screens, it seems Stan Lee fell back on trying to get some more of Marvel's larger and well-known properties optioned, with some limited success actually. Following on from the glut of new live-action shows that Lee managed to make happen, the Fantastic Four cartoon was an attempt by Stan Lee to both keep Kirby interested as well as doing work that would benefit Marvel monetarily, given how difficult that he had become to work with on a monthly title. Sales on Kirby's books were all over the place, but they were not doing well, especially compared to only a few years prior, and it was obvious to anyone with eyes in their head that Jack Kirby was not only dissatisfied with his treatment at Marvel, but increasingly uninterested and completely uninvested in what he was doing for the company. The Fantastic Four cartoon was supposed to give Kirby something he could work on that would interest him, while being a rather clever way of getting Kirby back on the Fantastic Four, the comic form of which Kirby continued to staunchly refuse to work on. There were a few major problems with the cartoon, all of which quickly manifested themselves and became painfully evident. First, Kirby didn't really work well in the confines of an animated project. This was clear and extremely problematic for production. While there had been plans to have Stan Lee contribute actual scripts adapted from their earlier work together on the Fantastic Four comics, the cartoon was eventually created using the exact same Marvel method that they had used when writing comics together the first time around. In Kirby's opinion, he was again back to not only having to help plot and write the stories for a series he'd refused to work on out of principle, but Kirby also found himself forced to work around Lee's ideas. The Fantastic Four was a tedious prospect for Kirby. He did not like working with Stan Lee again, especially in this capacity for starters. But I think that if the show had come with a little less baggage and a little bit better pay, he might not have minded quite so much. When Stan Lee had licensed the characters previously a few years before all of this for a different project, he hadn't anticipated the Fantastic Four cartoon, and as a result, Stan Lee would often end up doing this. He screwed the rights up to Marvel's catalog pretty royally, and the rights to the Human Torch were tied up to the extent it was decided that he wouldn't be in the series. And yes, you heard that right. It was going to be a Fantastic Four series with only 3 of the main characters. This was Lee's grand idea for keeping Jack interested. Again, I think if things had ended here, if this had been the extent of the headaches involved with production, Kirby might have been okay with it, or at least happier about the situation. This was not the case, however, and in hopes of not entirely alienating fans of the comic, while now also hesitant to tie up the rights to any of their other potentially profitable IPs, Marvel and Lee decided that they wouldn't be putting any of their other heroes, or in fact, any pre-existing Marvel characters of theirs into the show to replace Johnny Storm. However, they weren't going to be deterred by little things like not being allowed to use the Human Torch stop them. The show was called The Fantastic Four, though, so Stan Lee decided that in Johnny Storm's absence, they would just come up with a new 4th member. In the Human Torch's absence, Lee and Marvel instead envisioned a robotic sidekick who would provide much of the comedy relief that the show would require as a child Saturday morning cartoon. Insert Kirby groaning here. Originally, as is the case a lot of the time with him, Jack Kirby wasn't actually responsible for coming up with the designs that he would for the robot sidekick. For that task, Stan Lee had tapped the man who had designed the madly popular new X-Men, Dave Cockrum, instead. Cockrum, as talented a designer as he may have been, was completely unaware of the fact that Marvel wasn't allowed to use the Human Torch. He apparently was operating under the false pretense that they'd instead simply chosen not to include him for some reason. Because of this, an annoyed Dave Cockrum, who again is an extremely talented artist, turned in some of the worst work that he possibly could in hopes of convincing Marvel of their folly. He actually went so far at one point as to submit a sketch of a lamp on wheels, as well as what resembled a trash can with the number 4 on it. After 6 similarly preposterous proposals, Lee got fed up and Dave Cockrum got the boot. Kirby, while definitely not enamored by the prospect, knew that the robot was going to be a part of the show whether he liked it or not. While Cockrum had been jerking Marvel around, Kirby had been working on his own ideas, which he submitted following Cockrum's dismissal from the series. Kirby initially conceived of a small, heavily armed robot capable of flight, which he called ZZ-123. Lee changed the name to Herbie, jettisoned most of Kirby's meticulously thought-out weaponry, replaced any unnecessarily threatening aspect with the comedy relief aspects that they desired, and they were off to the races. While much of the work on the series ended up being Kirby and Lee reworking stories and ideas that they tackled together years before, Kirby absolutely hated working on the show. He was happy that he finally got his name in the credits, but as you might imagine by this point, while Kirby was getting paid his regular rate to work on the series for Marvel, who had agreed that this work would count as part of his contractual obligations to the publisher, he was pretty peeved that they didn't pay him a penny for the reuse of stories, characters, and concepts that he and Lee had come up with in years past. From all accounts, Kirby managed to remain civil with Stan Lee while working on the show, but it took a lot of doing on his part, and there were obviously hard feelings hampering their previously fruitful relationship. Kirby was apparently constantly doing different design elements and character sketches, which the studio incessantly wanted more of, and which he was expected to do along with his other assignments like Devil Dinosaur and the Eternals at the time. Along with Kirby's distaste for Stan Lee and resentment about the adaptation of source material, he wasn't suited well to working in animation as many had thought he would be, Kirby included. Instead, Kirby found himself struggling within the tight constraints and rigid requirements of the animation field. While most of the shows and cartoons that were adapted and produced during this time and for years before had been of an undeniably inferior quality, people hammered on Kirby's work for this series. He'd spent way too long working in a singular medium, and his mind was in many ways tied up in a thought process that did not lend itself to working on an animated series. This wasn't all Kirby's hatred for the work, his problems with Lee, or anything like that either, though. As I mentioned, Kirby was obviously getting older. His mind just was not firing on all cylinders like it had been in the past, and having to think about something as complex and which involved so many different compartmentalized aspects that he had to familiarize himself with to bring it to life was beyond him by this point. A decade prior, he would have been like a kid in a candy store, but virtually everyone involved with the project quickly decided that the big thing Kirby was good at, and the thing he seemed to enjoy, was doing design and character work. As I mentioned, Kirby would oftentimes spend his free time between pages on his remaining Marvel titles coming up with innumerable designs of potential characters for the show, and this was despite the series heavily relying on Lee and Kirby's previous work on Fantastic Four. Despite hating work on the actual series, Kirby had found something he enjoyed doing for the first time in a long while. This was the first extra work that Jack Kirby had done for Marvel since probably 1967. Stan Lee didn't seem to notice it at first, but others like Mark Evanier and apparently a bunch of the suits and other people from Hanna-Barbera that were involved with the series definitely did. With a little less than a year left on his Marvel contract, Kirby was absolutely miserable though. He was basically trying to distract himself with these constant character sketches and other design work for the series as it kept him entertained and doing what he loved most about comics: coming up with new stuff. It might have helped, but by the end of 1977, Jack Kirby was so far beyond unhappy, he was thinking about just not renewing his contract with Marvel. And he wasn't thinking about going back to DC either, or even to a publisher like Charlton, where Steve Ditko had found creative refuge at the cost of a decidedly heavy pay cut. He was burnt out, and Jack Kirby, the man who had literally been obsessed with earning a steady paycheck and providing for his family since the 40s, had all but decided that his time in comics was probably finally over. And he was kind of okay with that. While he would speak at length about it later in life, comic books broke Kirby's heart, and entering the twilight years of his life, still shackled to his drawing board and making no headway, Kirby was done trying. He'd experienced the dizzying highs of success and tasted the bitterness of abject failure and every point in between. Later in life, Jack Kirby would talk about the trials and tribulations and how he'd only stuck around the industry for the last several years of his career because he simply didn't have anywhere else to go. Kirby was in his 60s. He'd been making comics for almost 4 decades, and he had little faith he could successfully reinvent himself in another medium or line of work at his age. Kirby was willing to work, but his mind and his body simply weren't cooperating like they had in the past. He would have left comics right then and there if he hadn't been under contract or if he had somewhere else to go. In what seems like nothing short of a minor miracle, after literally decades of disappointment, work that he had benefited almost zero from, and being taken advantage of by nearly everyone he'd ever worked for, Jack Kirby was about to get a break. It didn't seem like much at the time, but it would be a big turning point for him, radically altering the rather bleak path that Jack Kirby had envisioned for the rest of his working life. After the conclusion of the moderately successful first season of Fantastic Four, Hanna-Barbera wanted to move the series from CBS over to NBC for the second season. This required pitching and selling the series to NBC all over again with a new and improved pitch, and Hanna-Barbera ran into a pretty big problem as the window to propose and sell the series for the next year's programming lineup closed. Both of the men who had been responsible for the original pitch packet and presentation art, Doug Wildey of Johnny Quest fame and the absolutely incomparable Alex Toth, had been the two responsible for initially successfully selling the series the first time around, and were basically the studio's heavy hitters when it came to design work, which they relied extremely heavily on for projects like this, and they were simply too busy to work on the new Fantastic Four pitch. Always the clever fellow, Mark Evanier, who, as I mentioned, had taken note of how much Jack seemed to enjoy working on the design elements of the Fantastic Four, had suggested to Hanna-Barbera that Kirby do the presentation packet for them instead. Hanna-Barbera, who was extremely pleased with Kirby's contributions to the series on this front, and were especially grateful for the design of Herbie, quickly tasked Kirby with the art for the presentation piece, and he was given a 2-week deadline. Seeming to sense that this was somehow a turning point, that he might finally be discovering a way out of comics, Jack Kirby reportedly showed up in 2 days with the finished presentation images, which were these massive drawings of the Fantastic Four that they wanted. Hanna-Barbera was blown away by Kirby's speed and quality, and so was basically everyone else who was working on the show with him, including the other animation studio. Hanna-Barbera were so impressed that they actually began to tap Kirby for other presentation packs, and it wasn't long before Hanna-Barbera and DePatie Freeling Enterprises, the other company involved, were both courting Kirby in hopes of luring him away to work for them. They both offer decent salaries, as well as a promise of ongoing work for the now 61-year-old Kirby and healthcare. However, his work on the Fantastic Four series and some of his other work with Hanna-Barbera had counted towards his contractual obligations with Marvel, which was still 15 pages a week. Kirby realized that even if he wanted to, he simply couldn't keep up with the 15 pages he was supposed to be doing and the better paying, less time consuming, and more interesting animation work he was being offered on top of it. While he wasn't able to take either company up on their offer of full-time employment at the time, this was the pivotal shifting point and probably the single most important series of events in what would become the second half of his career, one which didn't start until Kirby was in his early 60s, yet would prove to be one of the most prolific, prosperous, and enjoyable endeavors of his entire life. Join me next week as we delve into Kirby's final departure from Marvel, the ensuing fights that would continue with the company for the better part of the next half-decade, and Kirby's successful entrance into the animation field. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor, let this video play until the end. The more people that watch until the end of this video, the more YouTube will promote it. Don't forget to hit that like button and think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know either. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind-the-scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, early access to material, merchandise discount codes, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. You can sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and select the tier and perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can even make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the descriptions. And you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this documentary was made possible by the Jerk Broadcasting System, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, YouTube, and other contributors you see on the screen. I'd also like to personally thank my loyal Wednesday Warriors, Channel 10, Chasen, Clinton Salvini, Mike Dolan, Lynn Sinnette, Jay Rainwater, Super Chasen, and Mike Dolan again. Thanks as always for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only 2 things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.